Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to History in Lowell with me, Maritza Grooms, and my buddy Bob from UML. We are going to be talking about some serious things like immigration reform. And you would think that we would be talking about something going on today, but who knew that it was as hot of a button topic as it is today, then almost 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to about the 1920s. What was going on then?
So in the 1920s, so we finished in terms of history, locating it in time, we've just finished World War I.
Right.
And the United States has gone through from 1890 to 1910, the largest period of immigration in its history, on average about 1 million new people coming in a year over those 20 years. And primarily those individuals have come from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, primarily. Not to say that there's still not people coming from England or France or Germany, or Ireland, but they're coming in smaller numbers. And so in terms of the country as a whole, the character of immigration is changing, and by character I mean where people are coming from. And starting around 1910, even before the First World War, some people in Congress and others in the country begin to be concerned. They have this idea that people coming into the United States from Southern Europe are inferior people. And they articulate this. They call people coming from Italy or Greece or Turkey or Eastern European countries inferior. They say they're not as smart, they're not as energetic, and they come up with this whole pseudo-scientific rationale for saying that unless we curtail what they begin to talk about as bad immigrants, we're going to, again, using their terminology, we're going to pollute the race.
Right.
And we're going to essentially sort of almost create in the United States a country that's going to go downhill. So unless we stop that new immigration, people coming from largely, again, Southern and Eastern Europe, bad things will happen to the country. So they begin to try to understand and figure out what to do. And the First World War intervenes. And so immigration is off the front burner for a while people figure out how to fight a war, how to deal with what's going on in Europe. But when the war is over, the conversation ramps back up again.
Right, and these kinds of attitudes reflect and mirror kind of the earlier attitudes when the bigger immigrant groups were arriving in the mid-19th century. And that's how people felt, oh, well, we don't want these people coming in taking our jobs, or oh, we can't have these Catholics coming in and changing the fabric of what we believe in here. And here we are again.
A long time later, if you talk about the Irish in Lowell in the 1840s and facing religious persecution, if I talk to people, some of my neighbors in Centerville about, well, Catholic, you shouldn't be for a Muslim ban, because then in essence you're talking about maybe a similar ban that would have been put in place against your own ancestors in Lowell in the 1840s, when the power, the establishment, whatever you want to call it, the people that ran the city were decidedly anti-Catholic. And so there's a sort of, I would call it an ugly tradition running always just below the surface when it comes to immigration. And then every once in a while, that ugly sort of underpinning actually becomes the dominant ideology of a particular moment in American history. And so it comes and it goes. And usually, as in the case in the 1920s, it's going to get trotted out when the economy is slowing down, when there's economic difficulty of one kind or another, or there's political disruption. Immigrants become a convenient scapegoat for all the problems of America. And so at the end of the First World War in 1919, 1920, there's a wave of strikes, big strikes in steel, in automobiles. Even in Boston, the police go on strike.
Oh, wow.
And so folks who have already kind of made up their mind about being anti-immigrant tend to blame all that political unrest on immigrants.
And the loss of jobs, of course.
And right, and everything that goes with it, right? So by the early 1920s, so in 1921, 1922, there starts to be immigration reform. There starts to be, for the first time in American history, a quota system put in place that's going to So where before people just came. And when
No
Ellis Island was open,
restrictions.
they went through Ellis Island, and there wasn't like only so many people can France can come, only so many people can Italy come. People just came. They were processed. When Ellis Island opened, people had health checks. There was a literacy test that was already in place, but nothing in terms of you can only come from here or there. The only place that was excluded, I shouldn't say only because it's a big part of the world, Asian immigration was stopped in 1882.
Right.
With the Chinese Exclusion Act, basically saying, and it was prohibited in immigration legislation shortly after 1882 that the Chinese that were already here couldn't become citizens. But in 1922, there's a quota system put in place as an introduction, and then in 1924, there's a big immigration reform that creates a quota system for the entire country. And essentially what happens is the Congress decides to, and they're clever about the way they do this, right? They don't say we don't want Italians. They don't say we don't want Polish Jews. They don't say, so it's not like a religious ban
Right.
or a ban of a particular country or what have you. But they create this formula based on how many people from a particular country are already in the United States as of 1890.
But that's accounting for so many years prior to that, and those immigrant groups that only just came at that time.
Get excluded. Yeah, absolutely. So you see the error in their ways or the loophole or whatever, right? So again, they're clever. They don't want to stand up in Congress and say, we hereby decide no more Italians can come. Because that's not going to play well with a large with a large Italian American population that's come in since 1890.
Right.
But if you say the quota is only based on how many people are here before 1890, all the most recent waves of immigration, all Southern and Eastern European countries by and large, have really heavy curtailment of immigration. So places like Portugal go from several thousand to a few hundred, Italy several thousand to just around 1,000 a year. And so it dramatically changes immigration, and immigration really dramatically drops as a consequence of that bill, and it's going to stay really, really low until the 1950s and the 1960s.
Wow. So how were immigrant groups affected by that who were already here?
Well, if you were here, right? I mean, it wasn't as though if you were already here, they told you had to leave, right? But what happened was a lot of people did, in fact, leave. So large percentages of Southern and Eastern European immigrants, with the exception of Jewish immigrants who came to escape religious persecution, so they didn't necessarily have a place to go back to, but large numbers of otherwise Southern and Eastern European immigrants just left. And so high percentages, 40, 50% sometimes, of people who came went back. Greek immigrants, Portuguese immigrants, Italian immigrants, just went back to wherever they had come from. They got the sense they weren't really welcome here. And by the late 1920s, we also get the worldwide Great Depression.
Right.
The economy slows down in America. One of the draws, one of the pulls to get people here was jobs. Those jobs are going away. And again, you have bubbling up these immigrants are taking our work. So it's the combination of things, right? And so cities like Lowell, which had gained in population about 75,000 people in 1880, by 1910, over 100,000 people.
Wow.
And that influx was largely from immigrants. Almost half of everybody living in Lowell in 1910 has at least one parent born someplace other than in the United States.
Wow.
And so we're truly an immigrant city, but that's going to change with the quota system that gets put in place.
Wow. So when does the quota system get changed? Does it get changed?
Starting there starts to be efforts at reform starting right after the Second World War. And so the backstory in a way is that in the 1930s, with what's happening with Hitler in Germany,
Right.
lots of Jews are trying to escape Poland, other countries as well as Germany. And because we have these quotas, people can't get in. And so there are even cases where people escape from Germany or escape from Poland on a ship and try to come into the United States, and the United States won't let the ship dock. quota's already been full. Sorry, you got to go back.
Even with what was going on.
Even with what's going on, that's how much people wanted to cling to this quota system and say we can't violate the quota. So when the Second World War is over, and it's even more apparent what Hitler had been up to and everything that had taken place, there starts to be inside Congress a little bit of a movement, not a big deal at first, but to at least try to create some way to let people, displace people in from the war, and to relax the quotas in that way. So some of the first weakening, if you will, of the quota system is related to the aftermath of the Second World War and letting people in who were impacted by the war. So that happens in the 1940s and then the early 1950s. Also in the 1950s, there's a volcanic eruption on the island, Portuguese islands in the Atlantic. Lowell has a big volcanic eruption, ruins the lives of lots of people. And a petition comes from Lowell to John F. Kennedy, who's now a senator, to relax the quotas to let more Portuguese immigrants in who have been displaced by the volcano. And Kennedy and others in Congress introduced that, and then several thousand more Portuguese families are allowed into the country, some of whom settle in Lowell, and their next third generation might be watching. If you are, that's how you got here. People petitioned to allow more people to come in. And so several thousand families above what the quota would have been are let in. There's some, like the special dispensation. And so this continues, and then we're also, in terms of the bigger history that the immigration story fits inside of, we're in the middle of the so-called Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so the United States and the Soviet Union are grappling ideologically, politically over sort of world power, world domination. And the Soviet Union can use our racial politics, our still segregated country, and our lack of allowing immigrants in to say, don't let the United States fool you, about democracy and this other stuff. Look at how they treat black people. Look at how they won't let immigrants in. They're not so great, right? And so this also, it's not, when reforms happen, it's never always just about the immigrants.
Right.
There's
it's not
always
a pure desire to help these people.
There's always a subplot, right? There's always a subtext.
And it's thickening.
Yeah. And the plot always, the plot thickens, right? And so in this case, we've just had an effort we've had a revolution in Cuba.
Right.
Fidel Castro seizes power in Cuba. He's quickly sort of categorized as a communist, even though at least initially he's not. He's a nationalist. He's sort of like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were. Let's get rid of the British. He wants to get rid of the dictator in Cuba. And so the U.S. supports an effort to try to overthrow Castro. That effort is defeated. Lots of Cubans now who are on the side of the U.S. and on the side of the CIA and this coup to try to overthrow Castro now want to get out of Cuba.
Well, yeah.
But theoretically, because of the quota and everything going on, they can't get in. So now there's like legislation loopholes to let people in if they're escaping tyranny. And so Eastern Europeans who are trying to escape Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Czechoslovakia and other places, and in East Germany and whatever. And so all of this slowly bubbles up and boils over. And so John F. Kennedy, while he's president, writes a book about immigration reform and talks about America can't be America if it doesn't open up, if it doesn't let people in. It's also tied to the civil rights struggle. And so the idea is, in terms of the civil rights movement, voting rights, civil rights, everything, we have to do the same thing on this side of the aisle as well in terms of immigration. When Kennedy's assassinated, his Vice President Lyndon Johnson comes in, and Johnson decides to carry on what Kennedy had started, both in civil rights and immigration reform. So in 1965, so from 1924 to 1965, reforms are introduced to take away the quota system and basically create a number, how many people can come in on an annual basis, and also people can come in for family unification. So if you have family here, you can come in and it doesn't count against the new number. So
Right.
family reunification, and then sort of this opening, and at the same time, any restrictions, any quotas on people coming in from Central America, the Caribbean are lifted as well. So it's pretty much free flow. And so at that point, where people start to come from completely changes.
Oh, wow.
And so it goes from largely having been a European, Western European, Northern European immigration to America. It now starts to go. So the quotas are lifted off of Asian countries.
Finally.
And eventually that immigration really skyrockets from India, from China, from South Korea, from other places in sort of the Asian part of the world, and then as well from Central and South America too.
And this is all during the 60s.
This happens during the 60s, and then it continues on into the 70s.
Into the 70s.
And so the character of, if you looked at a map of like where people came from between 1880 and 1920, and where people have come from largely between, say, 1960 and 2000, it's almost completely different.
Are the reasons the same?
A lot of the reasons people are coming are similar in terms of, people's aspiration for some kind of a better economic future for their kids, and sort of the same reasons we've talked about with why the Irish came or why the French Canadians came. Some of it's religious persecution, some of it in terms of refugee populations that came, of which Lowell has taken in big numbers of refugees. Some of that came as a consequence of civil war,
Right.
political unrest. But the reasons are usually pretty similar.
Now, the role of Lowell being this open place for refugees, it seems like that's still kind of relevant today. But even at that time, why was Lowell the place to petition for refugees to come here?
So when the United Nations, basically it's the United Nations that creates this category of people who are going to be called refugees.
Okay.
And so it's like a specific kind of label. And so refugees coming in don't count, are not thought, they're a different category of people than immigrants.
Okay.
It's hard sometimes for people to keep the two things straight. So refugees come in under a completely different legal process. They come in, they eventually, if they're here, they can petition for citizenship and would go through the same process as an immigrant coming in would come in, but refugees come in a different way. And so refugees come in under a Refugee Relief Act, and it's set up in such a way that pretty much big churches, like national church denominations like the Episcopal Church or the Methodist Church or the Catholic Church or whatever, sort of sign up in a way to be refugee sponsors.
Oh, wow.
And so certain numbers, so the U.S. allows a certain number of refugees in on an annual basis. It's a very low number. I can't remember, I don't know exactly what it is now, but in some years it's been like 50,000.
So there's still a quota even on that too.
Right, and so, there's a quota on how, you're right, it's not like free flow, every refugee that wants to come into the U.S. can come in. There's like a faucet that turns on and off once so many people are here. So people basically are queuing up in refugee camps all over the world, right? I mean, just same thing still obviously today with Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, things happening with civil war and conflict in some African countries or, in Asian countries, whatever. And so in the case of Cambodia, after the civil war and the genocide in Cambodia, large numbers of people escaped into Thailand and were in refugee camps. And so why Lowell, the long and short of that answer, like that was your original question, I can't help it. The Lowell, for people to come in, there's only a certain amount of money available to help people. So you have to figure, right, if you're in a refugee camp, you have zero.
Right.
Everything that you had, you've left behind to flee. And now you're in a refugee camp with the clothes on your back and whatever else. And so people have almost like a little allowance when they come, small amount of money. They can't collect welfare. Some people think, oh, they're taking welfare. No, they're not. So in Lowell, it's the International Institute, which is over on Kirk Street. Yeah, no, not Kirk Street. What's that street over off Central? Anyway, over that way somewhere.
I know it.
Whatever the name of that street is, anyway. But anyway, the International Institute of Lowell has been in the city since the early 20th century, settling immigrants and refugees. And so they become the agency whereby when refugees are going to come to Lowell, they help them get settled, find work, find a place to live, and sort of get going again. And so Lowell is a place where people would likely come, partly because there's a minimum amount of money that can pay for housing. So you have to find places where there's cheap, affordable, whatever you want to call it,
Right.
housing to settle people. And so you're not going to settle significant numbers of refugees in Brookline
Right.
or Newton or, you know, someplace like that, or Concord, or, you know, it's just not going to happen because it's not going to work. It's not practical. So large numbers of refugees that come to Lowell end up in certain of what were at one point traditional neighborhoods of immigrants. You know, older parts of the city where there's still some level of affordable housing. And so that's why Lowell, Lawrence, Bangor, Maine, Manchester, New Hampshire, there are a certain number of cities around New England that would be old mill cities, or even like in the Midwest, the upper Midwest. So you sometimes have African refugees being settled in North Dakota.
That's
Welcome
a big
to
change.
winter.
Yeah.
You know, and some of it is also connected to where there's work.
Right. Yeah.
So in a lot of cases, there might be like in around Minnesota, North Dakota, there are lots of meatpacking plants where there's jobs, and there's not a lot of people to fill the jobs. So lots of times refugees will end up in those communities doing that kind of work. And again, so the requirement is that there be affordable housing, and there also be work possibilities. When Lowell is taking in the significant number of Cambodian refugees that it starts to take in, Wang Computer is here. And An Wang, the owner, the entrepreneur, the visionary, the starter of Wang Computer and his workstations, realizes, wow, there's a workforce here. So it's almost like when the Lowell Mills, which we've talked about before, are recruiting young women from, you know, New Hampshire and Vermont. An Wang is almost doing a long distance recruit because there's work, building, assembling his computers. And so the Wang Computer empire really grows. And so there's two big legacy buildings, if you will, of Wang, Cross Point and downtown where Middlesex Community College is. That building where Middlesex is was their world training headquarters, right? And so this is all happening at the same time. You get the confluence of new groups of refugees coming in, eager for work, and you get this, at least for a time, this bubbling up computer empire. Ultimately it goes away, the Wang Computer doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
But for a time, when people first settle, that first generation can get jobs in the computer field.
And there was a slight economic boost at that time because of tech companies like that.
Yeah, and so there's work, which again, sort of you don't want to bring people, plop them middle of someplace where there's no, depending on the skills people have and whatever,
Right.
you know, you just can't put people in a new place and let them sort of fend for themselves. It's not going to work. And so if the U.S. has this refugee policy, then it has to try to figure this all out. I mean, the interesting thing with this is, so a lot of the refugee resettlement, and as well even a significant percentage of what people will now call undocumented immigrants coming in, have in a way been created by, I think, in terms of my history hat, U.S. foreign policy. So big influxes of undocumented people are coming in through Central America. And in Central America, there were in the 25, 30, 40 years ago, there were a number of civil wars, huge conflicts, and the U.S. was supporting one side against another side, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and the spillover ended up into Costa Rica and other places, and a lot of people, to flee that violence, came through Mexico and ended up in the United States. And they came as a consequence of these political conflicts, some of which the U.S. had some hand in, the same way as Cambodia gets dragged into the Vietnam War by the United States widening the war into Cambodia and bombing in Cambodia, and that inflames passions in Cambodia, and that ultimately leads to the internal conflict inside Cambodia, which creates this number of Cambodian refugees. Same way now with refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq,
We've had our hand in that.
Yeah, you
all
know, I
those
mean, and
things.
which isn't to say we don't start out by saying, "Oh, good, let's create a bunch of refugees,"
Right.
but you have to understand. I mean, they're students of history, I hope, to some extent. You have to understand that war creates refugee populations. Historically, it always has. It always will.
Right.
Right. That they're the to me the the real casualties. Obviously,
Absolutely.
soldiers losing their lives. Yeah, but the sort of byproduct, if you will, of these conflicts is people being uprooted and dislocated.
Right.
And so this is a global challenge in terms of, Europe is going through the same thing as we are in terms of what do we do with all these populations? How do we settle them, resettle them? And again, so in our political situation that we find ourselves in now, they can become a really handy scapegoat. So Muslim bans, Muslim travel bans, all these things are no different than, those Southern Italians are going to, kill the race.
Or
In
they're going to steal our
1924,
jobs or
it just comes back around
infect us
again.
with their religions that aren't the ones that we want here.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so you would think, right, if you understand, if you're Irish and you understand your Irish history, you would think, okay, well, maybe I ought to like take a closer look at this Muslim ban and think like how I would feel if that was my grandpa trying to get in here from Ireland, or my grandma trying to get in here from Ireland, decades ago. There are parallels here that we need to keep in the forefront of our brains.
And it's really, it's a matter of compassion and like you said, looking at the history of our own stories. Where did we come from?
Yep.
And it's not like we were all just here. We know who was here first, there aren't many of them left.
Right, yeah, no question, right? And I think, for a city like Lowell, the fact of the matter is that absent the more recent immigration, and absent the influx of those refugee populations that we've been speaking about, the city would be flat on its back. It's that new immigrant energy, that new immigrant entrepreneurialism and all the rest of it that caused Lowell to bubble up and sort of redefine itself and become a really interesting and much more cosmopolitan place. It was dead on its feet in the 70s because the mills had closed, work had gone, lots of young people had left, and now it's happening the other way. Lots of young people want to stay. There's all sorts of cultural stuff going on, and a lot of it is driven by that influx of immigrant and refugee energy. And the city would be very different had that not happened.
Right, and we pride ourselves on our diversity, and we say, we're a welcoming place for all of that, and we have to really acknowledge that, and we have to really be honest with ourselves when we're saying these things. So also we have to look at who's representing these populations, and look at the fact that they've contributed so much, even since Lowell became Lowell. Immigrant populations are what made us successful.
Yep. Yeah. There's no way of getting around that you could call Lowell an immigrant city in 1840. You could call Lowell an immigrant city in 1880, in 1920, in 1960, in 1980, in 2000, and it will still be in 2020. It will be an immigrant city. That's not going to change as much as some people might perhaps want it to be wished away. It's not going to happen.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, for once again bringing us almost to the present.
We're almost there.
Oh, it's so exciting.
Next time.
Next time. And I want to thank all of you viewers for tuning in, and I hope that you're learning as much as I am, and I hope that you're as excited as I am about everything that we're learning and how we can apply it to today. Thank you for tuning in.